Hey folks, my name's Kevin and it's time for a little bit more knife nerdery. And today we're going to be taking a look at the Spyderco Swayback by Slysz. Now, this isn't a new knife, but I only got to check it out fairly recently when a friend of mine snuck this along in a package with some other knives. He didn't tell me he was going to send this, but he was trying to convince me of just how cool this knife is by, forcing me to sneakily check it out. Spoiler alert, he's right. Now we are going to be talking about the knife as a whole, but the thing I really want to focus on in this video is the bizarre and unique way that they're doing their stop pin configuration here. It's kind of brilliant. I've never seen anyone else do it like that on any other knife, and I think it's a large part of why this knife, running on Foster Brown's washers, has absolutely no discernible side-to-side play, and yet is able to easily fold my nail. That's actually pretty hard to do, and like I said, the weird, clever way that they're pulling this off inside is, I think, a large part of that. I can't wait to take this apart, show you the weird thing that they're doing, and then explain why I think it has the effect that it has. So let's get started by looking at this blade. This knife is just bigger than I thought it was going to be. In pictures, it always looked a little bit small, and a lot of swayback knives, especially traditional swaybacks, are rather small knives. So this one being just over 3.5 inches long is actually a pretty full-size knife, and the fact that it's as long and slender as it is, and the fact that this blade is as pointy as it is, it just has a more kind of intimidating appearance when I took it out than I was expecting. It has almost like a big raptor claw quality to it. It's not a particularly intimidating knife otherwise. It's a relatively short blade in this dimension, and there's nothing about this that is like giant, scary murder knife, but it is just a bit bigger and a bit more of a claw shape than I was expecting. Now this blade stock here is 0.136, and the grind height is only just hair under 0.7, and so often that is not a dimensions for blade geometry that I would love in a EDC knife, but the hollow grind on this is absolutely incredible. This is such a nice blade. This is one of the reasons you wanted me to check this out, because it's kind of a reminder that Spyderco has the capability of making truly phenomenal blades. The finish on this is something that Marcin's knives have been famous for in the past. Like, I think his probably most famous knife is the Bowie, the thing that Nick Shabazz has always heralded as like the best knife of all time kind of thing. And the finish on that is the same. It's got this beautiful mirrory stonewash. It's just absolutely gorgeous. It's one of my favorite finishes on any kind of knife. And they've also just done a really, really beautiful job of kind of rounding these corners. Now, sometimes it's really pleasant to have crisp, sharp transitions, but sometimes they do this kind of thing where everything just feels perfectly smooth. Now you can see that along the top, we've got chamfers that run this entire way and kind of curve as we go down. And so it's not actually a crowned spine, but because of these chamfers are at the angles that they're at, and because the transitions are so soft, it has kind of a similar effect of a crown spine, that you can kind of roll your finger over it and then it feels nice. But you don't have any of that crowning going on up here. But you do, of course, have that same nice, smooth transition there. The grind on this is actually pretty similar to something like the Holt Haptic. The blade stock is basically the exact same thing, the grind height is basically the exact same thing, and they're both really deep hollow grinds. But because the Haptic curves back up, and this one stays straight the entire time, this actually comes out to even a little bit thinner. The other really important difference is that this is thinning out as soon as it starts dropping past this point right there. This is where the flat ends, and so the blade remains the full blade stock thickness up to that point, and then everywhere that it drops below that is thinning and thinning and thinning out. The same thing's happening over here, but it doesn't happen to this very end bit, and so the result is that while the grinds on these are actually very, very similar in terms of any kind of dimensions, this one thins out so much more at the tip that we get this exceptionally thin tip. If we compare that to the same thing over here, you can see just how much more precise the one on the right is. Now, of course, you shouldn't pry with any tip. This is definitely the kind of thing you don't want to pry with, but it is so dang good at getting into tiny little crevices. It's the perfect like piercing tip. If you're trying to, like, let's say you have a clamshell packaging and you are trying to carve around something, get into a little nook and cranny, you cut off that kind of clamshell part without puncturing the thing inside. It's so good at getting that kind of precise corner in there. I love that. Another really important thing that they're doing is they're angling this entire blade down. So this is a flat blade. It has the ever so slightest, 1/4 of a millimeter of recurve in the very center, but that's just the kind of variance you're going to find in anything. This is, for all intents and purposes, a flat blade, but it's angled downward from the handle itself. And why that's so important is because it means that you don't have to twist your arm down, your wrist down, in order to get this tip below the handle and into the kind of piercing position to use this on the surface to cut along that with that front. This is just the perfect kind of blade to do that kind of pierce in and pull back to open like a box. And since that's the number one most common use case that I have, I adore when they do this. I've made a whole video about the Spyderco McB, and it's a much, much smaller knife, but it actually has the same kind of CTS XHP blade, and it does the exact same kind of angled downward thing, and so it's just perfect for piercing box tops. Now, I don't always love swayback handles when it comes to pinch grips, because the fact that it curves up like this, and the fact that my hand curves concave like that, means that it often leaves this kind of gap right here, and it doesn't feel my hand in a way that's super pleasant. And so I don't love this in a pinch grip choke back here, but the reality is this knife is long enough, and these little chamfers right here make this so good pinched up like that, or just choked up like this with my thumb right there, or leaning against that up here, that this actually does a new thing. This handle is long enough that it curves across this other direction on my hand, and actually feels delightful in this style of more choked up pinch grip. And so especially if you're working with this longer tip, this feels fantastic, and it curves my hand in a totally different kind of way than a knife normally would. Now they do a kind of typical Spyderco plunge grind where they just don't give you any kind of sharpening choil whatsoever. However, this isn't the full cliff that you'll find on some of the ones out of Golden, Colorado. This is a little tiny triangle plunge, but you can see that it does end quite abruptly right there. So you can kind of treat this as if it were a wall and just make sure you don't go past that as you're sharpening. It is a little bit tough. You might actually want to kind of mark off your ability to slide the thing over, and maybe even tape that or something like that so you don't come up there and accidentally make it smile. But overall, this blade just blew me away. It is such a good slicer because that hollow grind just stays thin for a really long time. I haven't measured them side by side yet, but it looks like it's just even a little bit deeper of a hollow than you find here on the Haptic. And so again, even though this blade stock isn't incredibly thin, this still slices tremendously well. The other thing that I found is that this transition being smooth right here, and the fact that this surface is so soft and smooth, means it has very little friction as it's pushing through stuff. I was really impressed with just how well this thing cuts. Coming back to the handles, we've got nice contoured handles the entire way. And this knife isn't thick at all, but it's 0.4885. And so between that handle thickness and the curvature, it feels really, really nice in your hand. This is one of those things where I find that the clip looks aesthetically wrong. This is the standard Spyderco clip, and I think it just doesn't aesthetically match this knife at all. There's much, much better looking aftermarket clips that match this whole pattern. But this is also a case where I find it's a little bit of a problem in my particular hand. This sticks up just far enough above this, and since this isn't very thick in this dimension, I feel these little back corners in a way that I don't normally. But like I said, if this were my knife, I would swap that almost immediately and it wouldn't be a problem. Now the handles themselves are just flat slabs. There's no skeletonization whatsoever, and that's to be expected if you've handled the other Swysh knives from Spyderco. They have the exact same kind of construction, but that does give this thing a little bit of heft. This is a 3.5-inch blade, but coming in at 3.936 ounces. And so it's over that ounce and inch mark, but honestly, it's not that much over. It's a big enough knife that at 4 ounces, you definitely feel the weight. It's not featherweight, but it's not so big that you feel like you've got a ton of weight swinging around your hand. The one thing I will say is that it's narrow enough in this dimension, like this height dimension, that it does kind of give me that dense stick in my hand feeling. I find that if a knife is going to be 4 ounces or more, I prefer being slightly taller and distributing that weight slightly more across my palm. And so this does give me that slight, like I'm holding onto a rod feeling, but overall the balance in my hand, like the way it feels as I'm moving around, is pretty well done. It's a little bit back heavy. You can see that the balance point is right about here at the back of this. And realistically, I'd want it to be all the way up here. The only way they'd really pull that off is with skeletonization skeletonization, so it would be cool if they did that at some point. I don't expect to see that coming. Now, while I'm have my finger here, this is probably a good time to point out this lock bar. One of the things I was surprised to see that's cool is that there is a lock bar insert here. That's surprising only because Marcin Swish's other knives of Spyderco, the Spidey Chef and the Bowie, they don't have that. And so I was surprised to see that, and it's nice because it does act as an over travel stop too right there. On those other ones, there just is no over travel, and I always feel like I'm going to bend it out just a little too far because they don't have a particularly strong lock bar pressure on any of them. It's a nice thin lock bar relief down here, and so it's pretty easy to push these over. But a big part of why it's so easy to push these over is because this style of cutout here, as weird as it is, and as some people don't like the way that it kind of leaves a hollow cavity in their hand, I find I don't particularly notice it or mind it in a grip, but what it does is gives you the ability to push entirely on the side of the lock bar. A lot of times you're kind of pinching along this top and trying to catch this, and I will say that if I was doing just that, if I don't take advantage of this hole at all and just kind of push it over at the top that you're on a normal knife, it's a lot harder. But because you can push from the side, it's so freaking easy to push it over, which is all the more reason why I'm glad that they have that over travel stop there so don't push it too far. However, this has a really obnoxious side effect of covering up the hole on the back. It's like that on the Bowie and the Swish too, but it's even worse on this. On those, you have like half of the hole exposed, and so if you really kind of shove the tip of your finger in there, you can reverse flick it. This one is, for all intents and purposes, completely covered up. I suppose you could get in there with your nail, kinda. Even there, I'm having a hard time doing it. But you're definitely not going to be reverse flicking this. The good news is that the thumb flick action is superb. It's so well done. The detent is really nice. It's a good firm medium thanks to pretty deep engagement. Let's shine some light up underneath. You can see that this is pretty deep engagement. It's not all the way, and that in itself is actually surprising to see. The Taichung factory in Taiwan from Spyderco has earned itself a reputation of having very shallow detent ball engagements and very light detents as a result. Now this blade is long enough that I wonder, I thought maybe I was able to eventually shake it out, but I had to do it pretty hard to get it to come. And so this detent is, I would say, a nice firm medium. And even though the edges on all of this part of the blade are all so rounded off, this still has enough crispness to it to easily catch my skin and flick out. Ordinarily, I think about how crisp the edge is with regard to whether or not it's going to scrape my nail. Like I said, you're not going to be able to do that on this knife anyway if you're a right-hander, but it's actually not the kind of thing that's going to scrape me at all. It's that perfect middle ground where it's crisp enough to catch your skin, but not crisp enough to scrape you. Now, it is important if you are left-handed, because this would be a reverse flickable kind of knife if you're left-handed, and it is. However, you'll notice that the lock bar is taking up an entire half of the handle here. And that means it's quite hard to keep your finger off this. I was able to do it by pushing right there. You can also, if you scoot the entire thing forward in your hand some, you can kind of put your thumb down here on that and flick up. But I think this would definitely be a knife that would be difficult for some lefties, because this does indeed have lock bar sensitivity. Anything with deep enough engagement is going to have lock bar sensitivity if you push pressure on that. But like I said, for me as a right-hand person, I'm just doing a thumb flick, and so it's never going to become an issue. So this knife is actually perfect for slow rolling. So if you're the type of person that likes to open your knife like that, it's super easy to get your thumb in there and just glide it around. Spidey holes are perfect for that. But I actually want to spend most of my time talking about the closing action on this knife and how they're able to pull that off. It's really, really cool. Like I said at the beginning, this is a knife on phosphor bronze washers, yet it has absolutely no discernible blade play whatsoever, and is still able to fall to my nail just from the weight of the blade. That's actually a hard thing to pull off. If you have a knife that's on washers, in order to get that kind of fall to your nail action, the pivot tension has to strike a very specific balance. You have to have it tight enough that there is absolutely no gap between any of the components there, but not so tight that that pressure is causing too much friction to make it so that the blade can't fall just from its own weight. That's really easy to do on a knife with bearings, because on bearings you can put a lot more pressure on that bearings and guarantee you don't have any gaps and still have the bearings be able to roll. When you have sliding friction like you have with washers though, it's a lot tougher to find that perfect exact point. Now this actually might contribute to why this knife doesn't have skeletonization, because a large part of being able to pull off that perfect balance is by maintaining parallelism. If your two slabs of handles there aren't perfectly parallel, what that means is that you're going to have a very slight amount of warp in one way or another, and that slight warp is going to cause one side to have a minute gap and the other side to have a bit of a pinch. And it's going to make it almost impossible for you to have that perfect balance point on that pivot tension to allow it to fall. I said that impacts why you might have skeletonization out, because the thinner that you make the handle materials, the more likely it is to have a very subtle amount of warp to it. So partly what they're doing here is just having nice thick slabs of titanium that are perfectly flat. But there's actually a much more clever, weird thing that they're doing here with the way they're doing their stop pins. And to take a look at that, we're going to have to take the knife apart. Okay, to take this apart, we're going to need a T8 up here and T6s in the back. Now, I personally prefer if you can disassemble a knife entirely from the lock side. That way it lays flat on your table. But this is the kind of clip that sits pretty flat anyway, and I'm going to be holding this in my hand for most of the time. And while this doesn't look like it, this is actually a captive pivot and only spins on the show side. So let's get going. So at this point, this should just kind of pop apart. And it does. Okay, so the very first thing I want to show you about why this knife is as free-falling as it is the size of these washers. These are tiny. For comparison, this here is the washer you would find something like a TRM Neutron. You can see it's easily 50% smaller. But why does that matter? Most people would probably intuitively say that the smaller the washer, the less overall friction there is. But there's this kind of obnoxious quality of physics, is that frictional force doesn't depend on surface area. It's called Amtom's law. It's that the lateral friction force, the sliding force, is linearly proportional to the normal force being applied down from above. So you've got F, the frictional force, equals mu, the frictional coefficient, times N, the normal force. And that surface contact area just doesn't ever come into the equation. The intuitive explanation for why is as you increase the amount of surface area, the amount of force per unit of area, the pressure, is actually going down. So you have the same amount of frictional force, it's just being distributed over a larger area. In this case, it's being distributed over an even smaller area. So it's not reducing the amount of friction, but it is relocating that friction closer and closer to the pivot. And what that's doing is reducing the lever arm distance that that friction has in order to act on the blade and trying to slow it. And when you're talking about rotational motions, you're actually talking about torques. So it's force times lever arm. So if the force is staying the same, but the lever arm distance is getting smaller, then friction has less torque that it can use to resist the blade. It's the same kind of concept as if you had two different blades that had the exact same weight, but one of them had a big hole back here and put all of its weight towards the front, and the other one had it evenly distributed. The one with its weight toward the front would fall more freely because even though their force, the weight, is the same, the location of that force, the center of gravity for the first blade, is all the way out at the tip, so its lever arm distance is longer. Same force, larger lever arm distance, torque, force times lever arm, means that gravity would have more torque trying to pull the blade close. The same thing's happening here in reverse. But there is one other thing that does have to do with reducing the friction. If you look at this surface here, and also the surface over here, you can see how shiny it is. They've masked this off when stonewashing this, and then left this with a polished surface. So the end result is that they've actually reduced the coefficient of friction itself by polishing this spot here. I love that. But now let's get to the juicy thing that they're doing, the weird thing that you don't see in anywhere else. And that's, look at this crazy stop pin configuration. What? On a normal knife, you don't have a stop pin attached to the blade at all. It would just be a little post that's sticking up here out of the handle. But on a blade with an internal stop pin, you would have a single pin stuck somewhere into the blade up here at the top. And when you rotate the blade, that stop pin would rotate with it through a smile-shaped arc like this until it hits into that in the open position. But what we've done here is we split this in two and put half on one side at the top like you'd normally find, but the other half screwed in to the back at the bottom. So now one is traveling from the bottom to the top like you would normally find, but the other one is still the same direction of rotation, but it's traveling from the top, rotating backward into the bottom. So similarly, this is the shape you would normally find for that smile-shaped arc that's traveling through. And if you look at this, there isn't really any other way you could orient this. There's just not any other room. You'd be running into this lock bar. But they have inverted it on this side. Normally these would look symmetric, but it's been swapped here. And that's what allows those asymmetric stop pins to travel through different paths as you rotate the blade. Now let's put this back together and talk about why I think any of that matters. Now this is, like I said, a captive pivot where there's a D shape in the pivot itself, and that corresponds to the little tiny D shape in the handle right there. So let's slide this up in. Now this knife has been recently lubed and it's slippery still, so I'm not going to bother applying any additional lube. I'm just going to put this all back together. Now I've not done any kind of tuning on this. How did we do? I don't feel any. Oh, it's a little bit tight. Let's back this out just a tiniest bit. Still don't feel any side to side. And now it falls to my nail. Look how easy that is. Trying to tune a washer knife to have that kind of balance normally, that is incredibly hard. Okay, now that we're back, I'm going to try and explain why I think that construction method prevents side-to-side wiggle, or perhaps more accurately, and this is a bit of a giveaway, why it prevents you from perceiving side-to-side wiggle. Because the reality is, I think that this knife is able to follow the nail, in part, like I said, because the lever arm distance of the friction itself is slightly smaller. But the other part of it is that this knife is able to maintain the perception of no side-to-side wiggle with slightly less pivot tension than you would have otherwise. And that less pivot tension reduces the actual amount of friction, because again, the friction is relative to the normal force on that washer. So how does this allow us to get less friction? On a normal knife, what you have is a standard stop pin that's fixed in place in the handle. The blade then, as it's opening, will eventually make contact with that stop pin and then prevent it from moving further. So from a radial perspective, it's the stop pin that prevents it from moving up. It's the lock bar that's preventing it from moving down. But the moment we look at this from a side-to-side perspective, there's nothing preventing this from wiggling side to side. If I pretend that this is the stop pin and the blade's just hitting up against it, you can see that it's easily able to wiggle in place. Now, when we switch over to an internal stop pin, like we have here on the waypoint, now the stop pin is fixed in place in the blade. You can see it right there, and it's traveling with the blade through the smile-shaped arc cut into the handles. So in the open position, it's doing the same thing as the regular stop pin. It's hitting the end of that channel and can't go any further, so it's preventing the blade from opening that way. Again, we have the lock bar preventing the blade from closing. But when we look from a lateral perspective, now the stop pin is adding additional lateral stability because it's fixed in place on the blade. It's moving in place with the blade. So just like these thumb studs here, if the blade is going to move left or right, that means that the thumb studs have to be able to move up or down. For the blade to move left or right, the thumb studs have to be able to move up or down. And so instead of having the ability to wobble so far, now we're spreading out the width of this bar, and it's like having the thumb studs up against my finger, or I can't wiggle back and forth anymore because those thumb studs are now pushing into my finger. To explain this a little bit better, I drew a little diagram here. Now, this diagram is not to scale. These washers right here are way thicker than they would be in normal, but I spaced everything out like this to give you a little bit of a better visual of what's going on. The other caveat is that this right here, this is our stop pin, and this little dotted line path here, this is like a cutaway view of that smile-shaped arc in the blade. This entire thing here, I drew further forward than it is in real life. In real life, we've got the end of the smile-shaped arc coming right at about the top of the pivot, but if I drew that where it really is, it would be overlapping everything else and it'd be really hard to see what's going on. So imagine that the stop pin has moved with the blade up through the smile-shaped arc and hit here against the back of this channel. This is it bumping into the back of the channel. Now this provides more lateral stability because you can't rock this downward into the channel. Ordinarily, this kind of seesaw motion that the blade can do is being prevented partially in each direction because it can't go down. You can, however, rotate up. Like you could tip up if you had enough wiggle room. Can't go down, you can go up. So if we loosen this just slightly, you still can have some wiggle here. Now with the weird split stop pin, what they're doing is inverting the directionality of this channel. What we have is something like this. where now one channel is going up and the other channel is pointing down. So on this side, the stop pin starts at the bottom of the handle and rotates upward with the blade and hits into the back of this channel right here. On the other side, the stop pin is starting at the top of the knife and rotating backward and hitting against the end of the channel down at the bottom over here. So now in this position, there is something blocking the knife from going upward and blocking the knife from going downward. So if we push that way on the blade, assuming that there's any gap in this pivot enough that would allow us to wiggle at all, if we push to the right, we're no longer going to be able to do either the lean down or the lift up. It's completely locked in place from motion to the right. But now instead, if we push to the left, now the stop pin is being exposed into the open channel in both directions. And so you would think that with this version, that you have total stability to the right and less stability to the left. And the reality is, I think that's accurate. But what's preventing that motion from happening to the left? The pressure from the lock bar itself. So now on any knife, when you have it closed, the lock bar is pushing against the side of the blade, and that's what pushes it over that way, and you have to fight against that to try and center this blade. So to get it centered, you have to fight that pressure. Well, the same thing is happening when it's open too. The lock bar is still pushing against the blade. So people normally would talk about the pressure from in this direction, that kind of compressional force of pushing the blade into the lock bar, preventing it from closing. But when we're talking side to side, there's a lateral pressure that's wanting to try and rotate the blade in this clockwise direction. So part of it is when you push to the left, your force is being countered by the force of the lock bar itself. But the other part of it is that if there is the ability to move it to the left, if there is some amount of wiggle room here, you're not going to feel it as a rattle because that motion is being dampened by the lock bar pushing against it. Rather than rattling in place, it'd be like pushing against a spring bar, and you just won't feel that the same way. So what I'm saying here is that on this knife, the way that it is able to fall to my nail is partly the lever arm distance of friction is itself smaller, but partly it's that we have this loose enough that there actually is a slight amount of wiggle. If I take this lock bar off, if I hold it like this and remove that lock bar entirely, it's tiny. It is barely there, but it's just a tiniest little bit of side-to-side wiggle now. This pivot tension is just light enough that there is a littlest bit of wiggle. But the moment that I put that lock bar pressure back on, I can't feel it at all. This feels bank faulty. And partly that's because the wiggle is being prevented by the lock bar pressure itself. And partly that's if I am wiggling it at all, I'm not feeling a rattling sensation because there's instead a suppressed lock bar bending sensation. It's dampened by the lock bar. Does this explanation make sense? Are you following along? I don't know how good of a job I did, but hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say. So what is my overall feelings about this knife? Honestly, this thing is incredible. It's still just a bit too big for me. For my hands, this 3.5-inch knife, it feels a little bit too big, but it also just makes me feel a little bit silly. It's just large enough in my hands that I feel like I've got some kind of raptor claw. But man, if this was scaled down to a 3 to 3.25-inch blade in my sweet spot, I would be in heaven. And since this is completely flat scales, you're not worrying about any skeletonization, I think that's the kind of thing that someone like Blade Chops over on Instagram would be able to do perfectly fine. I would want them to keep this same front proportion. I don't want them to like chop this off and turn it into a sheep's foot. I love the shape of this, but man, if you just cut off this back part, narrowed it right up to right behind this back screw, drop the lanyard hole because who needs it, tap some new clip screw holes, and shrink this front part down, man, that is a knife that I would absolutely adore. So if I ever pick one of these up, I think you know what's going to happen to it. Okay, thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.